The German existentialist philosopher Martin Heidegger says that we human beings are thrown into this world. We find ourselves here without knowing why. This means that there is no step-by-step guidebook for our journey. But does this mean that our lives are doomed to confusion and meaninglessness? Welcome to Pathways to Stillness. I am Dr. Gary Irwin Kenyon, your host. I'm a gerontologist and longtime Tai Chi practitioner and author of Pathways to Stillness. I decided to create this series as a result of receiving many heartfelt responses to my book. As with my book, this series invites you to a conversation about how it is possible for us to discover your own pathways to a journey with meaning, peace, and stillness. I am honored that Thomas Moore accepted an invitation to be my first guest in this series. Thomas has authored many books, but he is perhaps best known for his inspirational work, Care of the Soul. Thomas Moore is an excellent choice to launch this series. In my conversation with him, Thomas will share his wisdom about some of the major changes in his life, about learning to let go and give up control, how to age meaningfully, and the meaning of death. These are all important themes that I invite you to explore in my book, Pathways to Stillness. In the first episode of the series, Thomas Moore and Dr. Bill Randall share their wisdom about how they are finding their way through major life changes. Notice I say finding their way, not having found it. The journey is always changing. The wisdom they share is accessible to us all. We will first hear my conversation with Thomas Moore, and then following that, Dr. Bill Randall. So maybe it would be great to start with when we were emailing. I'd mentioned that I'd been on a retreat, and you said that most of your life was like a retreat. And I found that really fascinating, sort of with the backdrop of we're living in a culture where so many people think stopping or resting is a total waste of time. So I wonder if you would have some thoughts about that.
Yes, I'm sort of the reverse of the average person, probably. I'm always on retreat, and I go out into the world once in a while. I do weekend world excursions instead of weekend retreats because maybe you can see I have all my books around me. I work in a little room here in New Hampshire, in the woods. Our house is in the woods on a lake. So the nature here is very supportive of a sense of retreat. It's very quiet here. We have very few people around. We have neighbors, but they're quiet. We don't see them very much. And we're out on the water on our lake quite a bit and walking. We have a mountain right next to us. And I don't go up there anymore, but a lot of my family members do. So. And then I spent a lot of my time, most of my time, studying to prepare to give talks or workshops or write books or something. So I'm still doing what I did when I lived in a monastery, which was to see that study and reading were part of the spiritual practice.
So the inner life and the outer life is pretty connected for you.
Yes, I'm saying I think it's almost the reverse of people I know because the inner life is so intense and so dominant.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask you later on if you have any suggestions that can lead others to this direction. But speaking of the monastery, I am interested, if you wouldn't mind talking a bit more about your transition. I'll give you a quick background I've been going to a Trappist monastery here in New Brunswick for about almost 30 years now, a couple of times a year. So I've gotten to know the culture there and some of the monks there as well. So I'm interested, and I've gotten to know a little bit about how they think about their life while they're in the monastery, which on the surface of it seems pretty idyllic. But when they speak more about it, it's not so idyllic necessarily. But I was really interested in your transition from living a cloistered life to when you made the move to a monk in daily life?
Well, I was in a religious order that was not as strict as the Trappists. And I liked that about them. They were kind of, we lived a community life pretty much, at least when I was in it, my experience of it was primarily monastic. Although it was not a monastic order, it was an order that had a lot of, was major, its major thrust was monastic. Strong sense of community. And I was a student the whole time. I never got to the point of being ordained a priest. So I was essentially, for me, it was monastic life for 13 years. And, I go back to something you said, that life does look idyllic. And people used to come and visit me, people from the area nearby where we lived. And they would see us and they would idealize this life right away. And these people who are married and suffering the difficulties of marriage would come and think, whoa, what a great life that is, to be living in your own space and not having to deal with another person. Well, it wasn't like that, really. It was wonderful. Community life was very sustaining, but it's also difficult. You're dealing with not just one person, but a lot of people. So, and that was not always easy. And the vow of obedience was particularly difficult because you had to go and do what your superior said. You had to do what that person said. Mm-hmm. And that was, I think, the most difficult aspect of it. But I loved it. And I had no intention the whole time I was in it of ever getting out of it. I dedicated myself to it completely. But I think a lot of things happened to me. One was that this was a long time ago, and I was finishing up in the late 1960s, where at a time when there was a lot of change in the air, both within the churches, but also within culture at large. There was a lot of change going on, revolution, and, flower children. That was the whole really transformation of culture that affected me. And I think looking back, I didn't really think these things through, but I felt that I wanted to be part of that, and I didn't like being cut off from it. That's one thing. Another thing was that I had excellent teachers. One of my teachers, I don't know if you ever heard of him, but it's John Dominic Crossan, is a scripture, biblical scholar. And he's one of the most famous in the world today. And he was my teacher, and he was a very progressive person. And he still is. He's maybe one of the most progressive voices in this area in the world. And so I had that education. And I think you put those things together. And one day I remember waking up thinking that whatever had inspired me to get into this was now missing, that it sort of flew away in the night. That was my feeling. Mm-hmm. It wasn't just overnight, but it felt that way. So I was certain. It was so clear to me when I woke up that one day. I was absolutely certain that this was not for me. Mm-hmm. I went to talk to the man in charge then, and I told him that I didn't think I could go through with the ordination. And he was shocked and surprised because they all thought that I would be the perfect person to get through it. And he told me I should take a year to think it through. And I told him, no, I'm not going to take a year. It's clear to me. It's absolutely clear. So I left, and I never had any doubts or regrets. Never. Although I missed it. I missed that life. And I missed the friends that I had made over many years and all the connections. Mm-hmm. But here I am. I'm still, these days, I still speak in churches. I get up in pulpits and I talk about the soul and the spirit. I'm doing what I was planning to do, but I'm not doing it officially in the same way. But still, my purpose when I entered the monastery is now being fulfilled.
That's a really smooth transition. I've seen, as I say, some of the monks I've met in the monastery have left, and it hasn't been so easy for them to leave with guilt and other things that take place. And then some who are still there will say, I do have a 92-year-old monk friend there who's been there 65 years. And the last time I saw him, he's been very helpful to me over the years. But the last year or so, now I find he's asking me some questions, and I'm touched by that, first of all, because it's a role that I can hopefully help him with, and he's been going through some doubt after 65 years. What's this life about? And so of course, I'm not an expert on that, so I can't answer. But I said, there's old Saint Therese of Lisieux who had this huge doubt just before she died and he said, oh yeah, no. And I gave him another example. In the Buddhist tradition, they talk a lot about doubt as well as something, that needs to be accepted. And anyhow, thank you for sharing that. It's not an easy thing to do, just like if you're out in the world, so to speak, and you decide your marriage is going to end. It's not an easy thing for most people. So,
No, I don't mean to say it was easy, but it was so clear to me that I was doing what I needed to do. And I was in a community that was really quite wonderful. They were called the Servite Order. And they were very, very intelligent and very forward-looking and a warm community. So I think that made a big difference. The head of the whole order came to me, in America, came to me when I was leaving. And he said to me, Tom, he said, we know you and we know your thinking. And he said, this is why you're leaving, isn't it? And he gave me a summary. And I said, that's it exactly. We wish you well.
Yeah, wonderful. And now you will hear my conversation with Dr. Bill Randall, who will speak about similar life changes as we just heard from Thomas More. First of all, welcome my friend and colleague, Bill Randall, to agree to speak to this podcast series that I'm putting together. As part of this series, I did an interview with Thomas More, who's most famously known for writing Care of the Soul. I was very grateful that he agreed to be interviewed. And one of the first things we talked about, which I was really interested in, is the fact that he was a monk for quite a few years. So he lived a cloistered life and then left that life and even wrote a book. I was very interested to hear him speak about this major transition from becoming a monk to becoming a monk in daily life. As he discussed it, it was a major pathway in his journey. And I know you have experienced a similar transition, generally speaking, and I wonder if you could talk to me about that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Gary. I was a United Church of Canada minister from 1979 till about 1990. And prior to going into full-time ministry, I studied theology, as one does. And during those 5 years of studying theology, or divinity as it is called, I was very interested in something which back in the mid-'70s was being called narrative theology, which I can say more about later if you'd like. So I kind of tucked that interest away, and then I went into full-time parish ministry, first of all for 3 years in rural Saskatchewan. I had a 5-point parish, and I was on the road, many of them at that time not paved, so I was spewing up a lot of dust as I went from parishioner's house to parishioner's house, trying to get to know my people. And I listened to a lot of people's stories. I realized very quickly that that was a big part of what one does in ministry, at least in those days. And then I came to Fredericton here in New Brunswick and was in a city church for about 6 years. And then I kind of felt, this is a lot of work. It's a kind of a 24/7 type of profession. You never really are off the job. You're never really out of the role. And I was feeling kind of antsy about that. And these interests that I had sort of picked up back in my theological studies days in stories and narrative kept working away at the back of my mind. So I knew I needed to make a change of some sort, but I didn't know what to. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but I had an opportunity to go to Toronto for about 7 months and did a job for the United Church of Canada where I got to go all across the country to different university campuses, talking to chaplains and students and professors, etc., to find out what is university chaplaincy, what do chaplains do, When that finished up and I wrote my report for my denomination, I still knew that I wasn't ready to go back into full-time parish life. But again, I didn't know what to do instead. So I eventually went back to university, starting out in the field of adult education, because that's an aspect of parish ministry that I really enjoyed, getting people to, explore ideas about life and faith and spirituality and so forth. And I quickly realized that all of that interest that I had back in my theological studies, in story and narrative, maybe I can sort of pick that back up again. So as things worked out, and there were a number of, I can only call them synchronicities that kind of came into my path, talking about pathways. And I got a strong sense that I needed to dive into this whole question of life as a story. And that's about the time that you and I met, actually. I came back from Toronto to Fredericton, and I recall us having a coffee in the Officers Square, I think, in downtown Fredericton. I had not met you before, and I realized that you were interested in what was being called biographical aging, and you realized that my interests in life as a story there were a lot of parallels. And ultimately, as you well know, I was able to come to St. Thomas in 1995, St. Thomas University, and start teaching gerontology. And you and I began doing things together, writing some books, etc. And the rest, as they say, is history. In leaving full-time ministry, I don't think that I had a crisis of faith per se. I had maybe a transition experience in terms of my vocation. I just realized that for me, in my personality, full-time parish ministry, being, as I say, 24/7 in nature, just didn't really work. I think I'm enough of an introvert that I needed more time to myself, to reflect, to think, to write, and ministry can be such a public profession. I think this is actually something a lot of people in that line of work have as a conflict. Their work requires them to be out there with people doing whatever is needed at any time, and yet many times they are more introspective as individuals. So there's a bit of a tension. Well, I was able to make the shift, and there was a period of insecurity where I didn't know what I was going to do, and until the St. Thomas opportunity came up. So I guess that is a bit of an answer to your question. An interesting question, by the way.
Yeah, so your interest in story, and then as you came closer to and became working in the gerontology department, the story part goes back quite a long way for you. Like wherever these insights, bubble up within us, you kind of felt that you eventually had to give expression to that. It's interesting what you say about it's a bit paradoxical or perhaps ironic that many people, as you say, in the spiritual life as priests or ministers find that they're challenged to have some time, some stillness for their inner life. You would think it would be more of a balance, but especially now I'm more familiar with the Catholic Church, but the sheer lack of person power makes it really difficult, makes it really challenging for them to have any time to do that. So they're helping others, yes, but maybe I would argue there needs to be more of a balance there.
And I think there is probably more of a balance in present day ministry practice and more intentionality about helping people in ministry to take the time off that they need to take, have sabbaticals periodically, and so forth. But back in the day, for me anyway, that wasn't so much of an option. I do recall when I was in the community of Gravelbourg, Saskatchewan, or Gravelbourg, because it's a French community. I was good friends with the local Lutheran pastor, but also the Catholic priest. And the Catholic priest had about 2,000 families in the parish that he had to serve, and he was constantly on the run. Great guy, but I felt sorry for him being pulled in so many different directions.